To the future of the Hartwell Empire. Well deserved, everyone.
The loudest applause my ex-wife's family ever gave wasn't at our wedding. It happened 3 months after the divorce, inside a private restaurant in Atlanta. They were raising champagne glasses, celebrating something they thought they'd won. I stood just outside the room, listening. None of them knew what had happened 45 minutes earlier. None of them knew the phone call I'd just received. Looking back now, I almost wish I'd walked away before hearing what my former father-in-law said next, because those words changed everything. But to understand why that toast hurt so much, you need to understand 6 years of small moments that led up to it. 6 years of being clapped for just enough to stay in the room, never enough to feel like I belonged in it. I used to think I was imagining the distance. I wasn't. I just didn't want to be right. My name is Daniel Reyes. I was 32 when I married Melissa Hartwell, and if you'd asked me back then, I would have told you I was the luckiest man in Georgia. I grew up different from her. My mother worked 2 jobs, a diner in the mornings, a cleaning service at night, and raised me alone in a 2-bedroom rental outside Macon. I remember the sound of her keys in the door at 11 at night, the smell of bleach on her hands mixed with fryer grease she could never fully wash out. I paid my own way through engineering school, waiting tables on weekends and grading homework for underclassmen during the week. I designed load-bearing systems for bridges, the kind of work that's invisible when it's done right and catastrophic when it's not. I liked that about it. Nobody claps for a bridge that doesn't fall down. You just get to keep driving. Melissa's family was the opposite of everything I grew up with. Her father, Robert Hartwell, built a regional logistics company from a single delivery truck into a fleet of 200 trucks running freight across 4 states. Her mother, Carol, ran their social calendar like a Fortune 500 company runs its board meetings. Every appearance calculated, every dinner party a performance with a guest list chosen for optics as much as affection. When I met Melissa at a friend's barbecue, she laughed at something I said before I even finished the sentence. I wasn't used to that. I wasn't used to being found funny, or interesting, or worth listening to by someone who'd grown up with that much ease. She asked me questions about my work that most people's eyes glazed over during. She remembered the answers a week later. I fell for her slowly, and then all at once, the way people warn you about and you never believe until it happens to you. I proposed after 14 months, on a pier at sunset. Nothing extravagant, because extravagance had never been something I could offer, and I didn't want to pretend otherwise. She said yes before I finished the question. When I told Robert, formally, the way I thought a man was supposed to, he shook my hand at the engagement dinner and said, "Well, she could have done worse." The table laughed. I laughed too. I told myself that was a compliment, dressed up in the kind of dry humor rich families use instead of warmth. I've had 6 years to realize it wasn't a joke at all. It was an assessment. The wedding was in a restored plantation-style venue outside Savannah. 200 guests, a string quartet, string lights threaded through 200-year-old oak trees. My mother cried through the entire ceremony, the good kind of crying, and I remember thinking that alone made the whole day worth it. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, half the room stood up cheering. My side of the aisle, co-workers, my mother, 2 college friends who'd driven 6 hours to be there, was loud, unguarded, the kind of joy that doesn't measure itself. The Hartwell family's table clapped for 4 seconds. I counted, because some part of me noticed it even then and refused to let it go. Robert clapped with his hands barely separating, more a formality than an emotion. Carol smiled with her mouth but not her eyes, the kind of smile she probably practiced in mirrors before charity galas. I told myself, that's just how reserved people show love. I wanted to believe it so badly that I did, and I kept believing it for years, because the alternative was admitting that I'd married into a family that had already, quietly, decided what I was worth. The first 2 years of the marriage were good, or good enough that I didn't ask questions I should have asked. Melissa worked in marketing for a downtown firm, climbing fast, the kind of career her parents approved of because it came with a title and a corner office and a story to tell at dinner parties. She started mentioning a name more than she should have. Trevor Kane, a college friend who'd become a business consultant for the same firm. He was, by every account, charming in that effortless way people are when nothing has ever truly gone wrong for them. The first time I brought it up, gently, over dinner, she laughed it off, twirling pasta around her fork without looking up. Trevor's basically family, Daniel. Don't be that guy. That guy. I remember exactly how those two words landed. Like a door being closed, just far enough that I couldn't see what was on the other side, but close enough that I told myself nothing was there. I let it go. I told myself jealousy was an ugly color on me, and I didn't want to wear it. At a family dinner not long after, I mentioned, carefully, that Melissa had been staying late at the office more often than usual. Carol changed the subject so fast, I felt the temperature of the room actually shift. She asked me, mid-sentence, whether I'd had a chance to look at caterers for her charity gala, as if my sentence had simply evaporated. Robert didn't say anything at all. He just looked at his plate, cutting his steak with more attention than the moment required. I know now that silence was its own kind of answer. At the time, I mistook it for him simply not caring enough to engage with something so small. Sophie was born in year 3, on a Tuesday in March, 7 pounds 2 ounces, and the first time I held her I understood, finally, what people meant when they said your chest could physically hurt from love. For a while, everything softened. Melissa came home earlier. Robert held his granddaughter for the first time, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen directed at me. Something unguarded, almost tender, his jaw loosening in a way I hadn't seen since before the wedding. I remember thinking, maybe this is the thing that finally lets me all the way in. Maybe a grandchild does what a marriage certificate couldn't. It didn't last. By year 5, the late nights were back. The consulting trips with Trevor were back. Longer and more frequent. Sometimes overnight, always explained away with the specific, over-detailed confidence of someone rehearsing a story rather than telling one. I started noticing small things I'd trained myself not to notice. A change in how she said his name, softer somehow, like it cost her something to keep it casual. A new perfume that wasn't hers. A phone that stayed face down on every surface it touched, even the kitchen counter, even the nightstand, even in the bathroom while she showered. I brought Sophie to my mother's house one Saturday so Melissa could catch up on work, and when I came back 4 hours early because Sophie had a fever, I found the house empty and a wine glass in the sink with lipstick on the rim that wasn't a shade Melissa owned. One night, not long after, I found a hotel receipt folded into the pocket of her coat while I was gathering dry cleaning. A boutique hotel, 11 minutes from our house, room service for 2, itemized down to a bottle of champagne, and a dessert neither of us would have ordered together. I sat with that receipt in my hand for almost an hour before I said anything, running through every innocent explanation I could invent. A work event, a colleague's birthday, anything. I couldn't invent enough of them. I never could, not really. I just hadn't wanted to stop trying. When I finally showed it to her, sitting across the kitchen table where we'd once made Sophie's first birthday cake together, she didn't cry. She didn't deny it either. She just looked at me, tired in a way I hadn't seen before, like a woman setting down something heavy she'd been carrying too long, and said, "I never should have married into engineering. I should have married into something that photographed better." I remember standing in our kitchen, holding that receipt, feeling the whole architecture of 6 years quietly collapse without a single beam giving way loudly enough to hear. I thought, 6 years, and that's the sentence she's been waiting to say. I filed for divorce 2 weeks later. I told Sophie, as gently as any parent can tell a 4-year-old something like that Mommy and Daddy would live in 2 houses now, but both houses would always have her in them. She nodded like she understood more than I wanted her to. What I didn't expect, what genuinely surprised me, was what happened when I called Robert to tell him. out of respect, before the paperwork became public. I owed him that much, or so I believed at the time. He didn't ask me to reconsider. He didn't defend his daughter, didn't raise his voice, didn't do any of the things I'd braced myself for. He just went quiet on the phone for a long moment, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped, and then said something I didn't understand until much later. "Daniel, there's more to this than you know. But I can't be the one to tell you. Not yet." I asked him what he meant, my voice sharper than I intended. He said he had to go, and hung up before I could push further. For weeks, I turned that sentence over and over in the quiet hours after Sophie went to bed, wondering what more could possibly mean, cycling through every worst version of it I could imagine. I got my answer sooner than I expected, and it wasn't from him. 2 months into the divorce proceedings, an old family friend of the Hartwells, a woman named Diane who'd known Carol since college, back when they were sorority sisters at Georgia, pulled me aside at a mutual event I almost didn't attend. It was a fundraiser I'd been invited to before the split, and I only went because Sophie's future preschool was one of the beneficiaries. Diane had clearly had 2 glasses of wine, and decided that was enough to loosen a conscience she'd apparently been carrying for years. "You should know," she said, glancing over her shoulder like the words might follow her. "Robert's known about Trevor for almost 3 years. Carol's known even longer, honestly, since before you two were even engaged, if I'm being honest with you. They didn't say anything because Trevor's father is Robert's biggest logistics client. 40% of the company's freight contracts run through that family's shipping business." I stood there in a hallway lined with silent auction baskets, stunned, doing the math on 6 years of silence in real time. It wasn't that they hadn't noticed. It wasn't even that they were protecting their daughter's happiness, which at least would have been an understandable, human kind of blindness. They were protecting a business relationship, and I was collateral damage they'd decided, quietly, years ago, was an acceptable price to pay. That's when the 4-second applause at my wedding finally made sense, all these years later, standing next to a table of raffle prizes. It was never about reservation. It was about knowing, even then, that I wasn't the priority in the room. I was the placeholder, the reliable, unremarkable man who'd keep their daughter settled, while nothing was allowed to threaten the freight contracts. I wish I could tell you I confronted them right away. I didn't. I drove home from that fundraiser and sat in my own driveway for 40 minutes, engine off, hands still on the wheel, just breathing, replaying every dismissed comment and every 4-second clap through 6 years of memory, like I was re-watching old security footage and finally understanding what it had captured all along. Then I did something different than I'd done for 6 years. I stopped waiting to be clapped for, and I started building something that had nothing to do with their approval at all. My business partner, Marcus, and I had spent 2 years developing a retrofit system for aging highway bridges, a patent that made structural repairs faster and 40% cheaper than existing methods, using a composite reinforcement technique I'd first sketched on a napkin during a lunch break years earlier, back when I still believed being quietly excellent would eventually be enough for someone to notice. We'd been pitching it to state contractors since before the divorce even started. It had gone quiet for months, buried in the kind of bureaucratic silence that makes you assume the worst. I'd almost forgotten how much I needed it to work. Not for the money, not even really for vindication, but for something to hold on to that was entirely, undeniably mine, built with my own hands out of my own mind, untouched by anyone else's approval or disapproval. Meanwhile, custody negotiations for Sophie turned uglier than I expected. Melissa's lawyer painted me as cold and absent. The same lie the country club had already been whispering for months. The story writing itself the way stories do when the people telling them have more money for lawyers than I did. I sat through depositions where people who'd known me for years described a version of myself I didn't recognize. Distant, work-obsessed, emotionally unavailable. Someone even brought up long hours I'd worked on bridge inspections as evidence of neglect, without ever mentioning I'd taken Sophie to every single one of her pediatrician appointments, every school function, every single bedtime I wasn't traveling for work. I remember sitting in my car after one particularly brutal deposition, gripping the steering wheel, thinking that if I lost primary custody because of a narrative built entirely out of the silences the Hartwells had spent years cultivating around me, I didn't know. There's one evening from that period I still think about more than almost any other. Sophie was 5, sitting on the kitchen counter while I made her grilled cheese, swinging her legs and humming something from a cartoon. "Daddy," she said, out of nowhere, "why doesn't Grandpa Robert ever come to my swim lessons?" I didn't have a good answer for her. I still don't, not really. I told her that some grown-ups show love in quiet ways, the same lie I'd told myself for 6 years, and watched her nod and accept it, because 5-year-olds trust you completely, the way I once trusted a family that had already decided, long before I understood it, exactly how much space I was allowed to take up. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the state contract paperwork spread out in front of me, and I made a promise to myself. Quiet, unspoken, but absolute. Whatever happened with the Hartwells, Sophie would never grow up believing love had to be earned in 4-second increments. Nick drew on how I'd forgive any of them, myself included, for staying quiet as long as I had. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, it was my scheduled weekend to pick up Sophie from a family dinner at a private restaurant in Atlanta. The Hartwells still saw her regularly, and I'd never fought that arrangement, no matter what I'd learned about them, because Sophie loved her grandparents, and I refused to let my anger cost her that. I arrived early. I was standing just outside the private dining room, waiting for the right moment to knock, straightening my jacket out of old habit, when my phone rang. It was Marcus, and his voice was shaking before he'd even said my name properly. Daniel. A pause, like he needed a second to believe it himself. They approved it, the state contract. All 12 bridges, 3 counties. It's done. Signed, finalized, done. 8 figures, Daniel. We did it. I stood in that hallway for a full minute, phone still warm against my ear, feeling something crack open in my chest that had been sealed shut for years. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter and heavier than that. Something closer to relief. 45 minutes earlier, my entire life had changed. And on the other side of that door, none of them had any idea. That's when I heard the laughter, the clinking of glasses, Robert's voice, raised in a toast, that particular register he used for speeches he'd clearly rehearsed. To Melissa, he said, for finally getting her life back. God knows a bridge inspector was never going to give her the life she deserved. The table laughed. I could pick out Melissa's laugh among them, a little too bright, a little too eager to prove she found it as funny as everyone else did. I stood frozen just outside the door, listening to a room full of people celebrate a version of me that no longer existed, if it had ever existed at all outside of their own convenient assumptions. Then Carol's voice, lighter, crueler for how casually she said it, the way people are only cruel when there's certain no consequences coming. At least Sophie won't grow up thinking a toolbox is a personality. More laughter. Someone, maybe Trevor, though I couldn't be sure, adding something I didn't catch. I remember thinking, in that moment, phone still in my hand, that I could turn around and leave, and no one would ever know I'd heard any of it. Some part of me wanted to. The same part of me that had spent 6 years choosing silence over confrontation. But another part of me, the part that had just spent 45 minutes learning what my own hands could build without anyone's permission, decided I was done disappearing quietly. I opened the door. Robert stood to greet me with that same practiced, 4-second courtesy he'd given me since the day I married his daughter, his hand already extending out of pure muscle memory. Melissa's smile faltered mid-formation. Carol's champagne glass hovered, forgotten, halfway to her lips, catching the light in a way that would have looked lovely in a photograph and looked absurd in that moment. I asked, evenly, for Sophie. My voice didn't shake, which surprised me more than it should have. And that's when the valet appeared in the doorway, apologetic and entirely unaware of what he was about to detonate, and said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, "Sir, your phantom is ready whenever you'd like to leave." The room went silent in a way I'd never heard a room go silent before. Not polite silence, not awkward silence, but the specific silence of a group of people, simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they knew. Melissa's fork stopped in the air, halfway to a plate she'd stop eating from entirely. Robert's smile held a beat too long before it slipped entirely off his face, like a mask coming loose at the hinges. "You're... what?" Carol finally managed, setting the glass down with a small, sharp clink against the table. I told them plainly. No gloating, no raised voice, because I didn't need either, not anymore. The contract. 12 bridges, 8 figures. Finalized 45 minutes before I walked through that door, while they were toasting to my irrelevance with champagne I could now, technically, buy the vineyard that made it. Robert sat down slowly, like his legs had made the decision without consulting the rest of him. Melissa said nothing at all, staring at her plate the way I used to stare at mine at their dinner table for 6 years. For the first time in 6 years, I watched an entire room run out of things to say to me, and I felt no triumph in it, only a strange, clean quiet, like a bridge finally settling into the load it was built to bear. I picked up Sophie, who ran to me the second she saw me, completely unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred over her half-eaten dessert. I thanked the table for dinner, genuinely, because whatever else was true, they had fed my daughter and kept her safe for an evening, and that still mattered, that would always still matter regardless of anything else I now knew about them. Then I walked out to the car, Sophie's small hand in mine. Through the restaurant window, as I buckled her into her booster seat, I could see them still sitting there, champagne going flat in untouched glasses, nobody quite able to look at anybody else, the performance of the evening having run entirely out of script. Robert called me 2 days later, not to apologize. I don't think that was ever fully in him, not after a lifetime of measuring relationships and contracts, but to ask, carefully, almost humbly, whether my firm might need subcontractors for the retrofit project. I told him I'd think about it. I still am, most days leaning toward no, some days leaning toward the strange satisfaction of watching him need something from me for once. Melissa and I built a working co-parenting relationship in the months that followed. Not warm, but honest, which is more than either of us managed for most of our marriage. Carol and I have exchanged maybe a dozen words since that dinner. That's fine. Some relationships were never mine to save, and I've stopped grieving the ones that were never real to begin with. For 6 years, I measured my worth by how loudly that family clapped for me. And I never once noticed that their applause had always come with conditions I wasn't allowed to see. Conditions written in freight contracts and business relationships I didn't even know existed. It took losing their approval entirely to understand something simple. Something I try to teach Sophie now in ways that don't require a divorce to learn. Some people will only ever clap for the version of you that doesn't threaten how they see themselves, or how they see their own interests. I don't need Robert's 4-second courtesy anymore. I don't need Carol's tight-lipped smile, practiced for galas and weddings and every performance in between. I built something with my own 2 hands, the same way I always had, long before any of them ever noticed me. And this time, I wasn't building it for their applause. I was building it because it was mine, because a bridge doesn't need anyone's permission to hold its weight. And neither, I've learned, do I. Sophie is 7 now. She's never asked again why Grandpa Robert doesn't come to her swim lessons. Some questions answer themselves, eventually, if you just give them enough time. If you've ever been underestimated by people who were supposed to be family, if you've ever watched a room decide you were small before you'd even had the chance to prove otherwise, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe to Blind Spot. There's another story waiting next week, and there's a good chance it's someone you'll recognize a little of yourself in.